It's the FIDE World BLE Team Final, and we have an all-Indian showdown. The young Phenom Praggnanandhaa takes on the powerful Grandmaster Vidit in a battle with everything on the line. And we open with a rock-solid Queen's Gambit declined. Both players are developing symmetrically, creating a very classical and tense structure. No one is giving an inch early on. The development continues logically. Both sides castle their kings to safety, but White's knight jumps into e5, creating a central strong point and asking Black the first serious questions of the game. Pragg begins to apply pressure on the queen side, pushing his c-pawn and bringing a rook to the c-file. He's looking to challenge Black's pawn structure and create an imbalance. And here's the first firework. Pragg unleashes the pawn to c5, a brilliant sacrifice. The idea is to break open the position and tactically win a piece if Black takes on e5. Vidit accepts the challenge, taking the knight on e5. Pragg immediately recaptures with the pawn, and now the central tension is at its peak. But Vidit has a brilliant response of his own. The knight leaps to e4, a fantastic counter-sacrifice that completely neutralizes White's idea and ensures he wins a pawn back, keeping the game dynamically balanced. The knights are exchanged, and a bishop takes its place on e4. The dust settles, and we're in a very complex, roughly equal middle game. Now a delicate maneuvering phase begins. Both players are shuffling their pieces, improving their positions, and probing for weaknesses. The queens and bishops dance around the board, each looking for the right moment to strike. The strategic battle continues. Rooks come to central files, and Vidit prepares to challenge on the queen side with b6. The pawn trade on b6 opens the file, and both sides are now fighting for control. White has a solid position, but needs to be careful. The engine preferred keeping the queen flexible. Queen to d2 keeps everything under control. After rook to c8, White can play pawn to h4, and after queen to b8, the queen returns to d4, maintaining the balance. But in the game, Pragg plays queen to e3, an inaccuracy that allows Black to seize the initiative for the first time. And Vidit strikes immediately. The pawn rams forward to c5, taking advantage of the queen's placement to challenge White's center. White is under pressure and must resolve the central tension correctly. Ignoring the threat is dangerous. The best way was to take the pawn on d5. After Black recaptures, pawn to f4 holds the line. Even after pawn to d4, the bishop can take, winning a pawn and staying in the game. Instead of dealing with the center, White plays pawn to h4. This is a much more serious inaccuracy, as it does nothing to stop Black's main idea. And there it is. Vidit smashes through with the pawn to d4, blowing the center wide open and taking a decisive advantage. White has no choice but to capture, and the bishop takes the pawn on d4. And now pawn takes the bishop on d4. A great move from Vidit, and in fact the only move to keep the winning advantage, setting up a crushing tactic to win material. Pragg recaptures with the queen on d4, but Black's attack is just getting started. Vidit has a winning position, but finding the most clinical path is key. Here, he had a chance to cash in immediately. The killer blow was rook takes the pawn on b2. After bishop to f1, knight to f8 follows, and after king to h2, the rook simply takes another pawn on a2, and White's position collapses. However, in the game, he plays knight to f8 first. This is an inaccuracy that lets White off the hook for a moment. Pragg gets a chance to consolidate. Rook to d2 defends, but Black's rook swings to b4 to keep the pressure on. The queens trade barbs, and Black gives a check on b6. The White king is feeling the heat and has to step away from the check, but where it steps is critical. The safer square was king to f1. Black can play queen to b8, but after king to f2 and pawn to h5, White is still fighting. But the move played, king to h2, is another slip. It looks safe, but it actually puts the king in a more vulnerable position. And Vidit immediately punishes it, swinging his rook to b8 to prepare a deadly invasion on the b-file. White brings the rook over to c2, but this is another inaccuracy. The key was to play bishop to d1 to defend against the coming invasion. Now Black's attack becomes overwhelming. Black's queen dives into f2, a horrifying invasion. White's king is forced to run out to h3, and it's looking desperate. Vidit has a completely winning position here, with White's king on the run. But in this critical moment, he stumbles. Bishop to f5, check king to h2, queen takes pawn on h4, check king to g1, bishop to g6. Instead, he played queen to e1. This is a major mistake that throws away almost the entire advantage, letting White back into the game. Pragg seizes his chance. The rook comes to c1, and Black's aggressive queen is forced to retreat back to f2. And now, a brilliant defensive shot. Bishop to b5. A stunning sacrifice from Pragg that completely disrupts Black's coordination and fights for survival. But Vidit is up to the task. Queen takes the rook on d2. An absolutely brilliant counter-sacrifice, correctly navigating the chaos and maintaining a small edge. Pragg plays queen takes the queen on d2, a great move and the only one that holds the position. Anything else would have lost on the spot. The smoke clears after the rook takes the bishop on b5, and we are in a new, tense endgame. The position is complicated, and precision is everything. White needs to find the best way to coordinate. The strongest move was queen to d1. After pawn to a3, and pawn takes a3, and king to h7, the rook can hit c7, and white is holding on. But in the game, Pragg plays rook to c2, an inaccuracy that allows the advantage to slip firmly back to black. And Vidit pounces, with the rook snatching the key pawn on e5. White's queen tries to create counterplay, but black's rook finds a new home on a5. White's position is becoming more difficult to defend. Every move counts. Rook to c4, rook to b5, rook takes pawn on a4, rook takes pawn on b2, rook to a7. Instead, we see rook to c7. This allows black to push the e-pawn and create a monster-passed pawn. Vidit begins the final push. The e-pawn marches forward, the rook swings to b5, and the knight arrives on the beautiful e6 square, completely dominating the board. This is the last chance for white. The position is dire, but king's safety has to be the top priority. King to h2, rook to c5, queen to d2, knight to d4, rook takes pawn on a4, but instead, Pragg plays rook takes the pawn on a4. This is the final decisive mistake. He grabs a pawn, but fatally neglects his king's safety, and Vidit delivers the knockout blow. Knight to f4, check. A fantastic move, the only one that wins, and it initiates a forced sequence. Here's the crushing follow-up. The king must move to h2. Then the rook takes the pawn on b2. The king is forced to h1, and rook to b1 is a devastating check, winning material and the game. White's king is flushed out to g4, but black delivers one final check with the pawn to h5, and it's all over. And in this completely hopeless position, Praggnanandhaa resigned. Vidit takes the win for his team. Here's the beautiful final tactic that white saw coming. King to g3, knight to e2, check king to f2, knight takes queen on c3, pawn takes knight on c3.